Hello, everybody. My name is Alejandra. Thank you for being here, watching either from the live stream or being in this Zoom call. We're hosting this webinar today titled The Eco-Fascist History of Conservation. Will XR be part of a new path? This webinar is brought to you by both XR Internationalist Solidarity Network and XR Youth Solidarity based in the UK. Today we've got some amazing panelists from Survival International, who for a decade have been fighting alongside indigenous peoples across the world to demand land rights and respect to their way of life. Here in the West, often we see conservation as a progressive force of good, but its history, it's rooted in ecofascism and racism, which still underpins many of its projects today. As such, today XR Youth has asked 3 people from Survival International, who have worked in this issue for many years, to say what they think and to learn from what they've got to say.
I'd like to begin by noting that the famous American film director Spike Lee gave an interview yesterday about the George Floyd riots, and he said, "The land was stolen from native people. Genocide was committed against the native people, and ancestors were stolen from Africa and brought here to work. So the foundation of the United States of America is genocide, stealing land, and slavery. Any architect will tell you that if you don't have a strong foundation, the building is going to be shaky from day one." And that could pretty much equally apply to conservation. And at Survival International, we've been working for several decades, as Ali said, to decolonize it. We think this is something about which people need to figure out whose side they're really on. So let me begin by saying that conservation is great. We need nature. We need to stop the sprawling industrialization polluting yet more of it. We need to stop the destruction of biodiversity. We need to fight climate chaos, and these are really big issues. The problem is this what actually happens with protected areas and conservation? Because if it isn't, then we're not solving anything with more protected areas or by supporting conservation, and we could actually be making things worse. And to understand how I am one of many who've come to that deeply shocking conclusion, we need to look at what actually happens in protected areas. And the best example of them is the world's national parks. Now, let me also say I'm a really big fan of many of the places which are now national parks. I've walked and climbed in them in 4 continents, and I really, really want these places to work. To understand the problem, we need to go back to their beginnings, which is about 160 years ago in the States, when the immigrant settlers, the American white immigrant settlers, were fighting the Native Americans. They wanted to herd them into reservations so they could control them and take the land and natural resources for themselves. And the Native Americans were thrown out of the national parks, the first ones like Yosemite and Yellowstone. They were robbed of a life of plenty and forced into destitution, many of them killed. Now, the early American conservationists were usually big game hunters. In fact, there's a club which says it's America's oldest conservation organization, called the Boone and Crockett Club. It was founded by the president of the States at the time, and it's a club of big game hunters. And lots of hunting clubs say they're conservation organizations. So how come? Big game hunters wanted to protect what they saw as their herds of game animals, things like bighorn sheep and bison in the States, from people who hunted them to eat, people like Native Americans and also some poor settlers. So they were the human predators of these herds, but there were also animal predators like wolves and so on. So the wolves were killed, the Native Americans were gotten rid of. Now, the problem is if you remove the predators from an ecosystem, then the plant-eating animals grow quickly in population. Elephant herds, for example, can double their numbers every 10 to 12 years. They quickly eat the available vegetation, and then they start to sicken and die. So the conservationists in the States had to invent what they called game management, which means killing members of the herd, keep their numbers down, ensure only healthy individuals could breed. which is what, of course, the wolves had been doing and the Native Americans had been doing when they hunted them for food. They refined their techniques of game management, and here comes the really, really nasty bit, which everybody's tried to whitewash out of the history. They applied those same techniques of game management to people. Now, this was a time in North Europe and the United States when science believed in eugenics, that there was one so-called race, Northern Europeans or Aryans. That race was the most evolved, the most civilized, the most inventive in the world, and the other so-called races were way down on the scale. And the American settlers were worried that the northern white race was being overrun by poor immigrants from Southern Europe, Jewish people, people from Sicily, and so on. So they came up with 3 ways of solving this problem. 1, stop immigration from non-Aryan countries. 2, curb population growth by compulsorily sterilizing poor women. 3, outlaw interracial sex and marriage. So all of these ideas come from game management as applied to people. And in 1916, one of the most famous American conservationists, a big game hunter called Madison Grant, wrote a book describing his racist ideas in great detail. He was a key figure in the establishment of several national parks and conservation organizations, including one which became the Wildlife Conservation Society, which is still going. It had kept a Congo so-called pygmy man as an exhibit in the New York Zoo. Grant sent his book to Adolf Hitler in Germany, who called it his Bible and used it to base his theories of German fascist racism. And German Nazism had very significant links to conservation and to ideas such as rewilding. So let's look quickly, of course, this is a huge subject. Let's look quickly at each of these 3 racist pillars from early conservation. Surely they've all been completely cleaned out of conservation today. Well, no, take immigration, for example. There's a key Extinction Rebellion spokesperson who is against large-scale immigration. He does say we have to be for the rights of migrants, but I actually don't understand how climate change, which is a global problem, has anything to do with immigration at all. And we all know about Trump's wall and so forth. So what about the next one? Forcible sterilization. Well, conservation NGOs like WWF are funding family planning projects in India today, which include sterilizing women. Not forced in the way it used to be, perhaps, but often significant coercion. And so-called overpopulation is still one of the key rallying cries of conservation. We all know very famous conservationists who are going on constantly about overpopulation. In fact, the problem isn't overpopulation, it's overconsumption. So what about the 3rd pillar, banning interracial sex and marriage? That, of course, was the key of South African apartheid. It was still on the American statute books in various states until the 1960s. It was still the law in Sweden until the 1970s. And again, we find that big conservation organizations, WWF again, were heavily implicated in the apartheid regime in South Africa. They were funding militias and private armies and so forth. So that's the briefest possible historical look at what's really gone wrong. And I began with the land theft and evictions, the central feature of the early national park movement. That started happening in Africa in the 1920s. The first African national park is now called Virunga. It was really pushed for by an American called Carl Ackerley, who went there looking for gorillas. And when he saw one, he shot it. He was also a big game hunter. Virunga pushed all the local indigenous people off their land, and that's how the story starts in Africa. And since then, it's a litany of evictions, destruction of whole peoples, people who are characterized as poachers when sometimes they're local people just looking for food or medicine or firewood or grazing, subjecting them to military militias, shoot on sight policies, constant abuse from park rangers. Now, in countries where the local people are politically strong, they're not pushed out of parks, but in places where they are politically weak, they are. And I don't think there's a single national park in Africa which was created without evicting the people who lived there. And part of this appalling tragedy, apart from the human rights violations, is that it's now proven that indigenous peoples are the best conservationists. So getting them out of these areas is just making the problem worse. And we should also bear in mind that many of these protected areas are in fact established for tourism. There's industrial exploitation, including mining and logging going on inside them, often with the complicity of conservation NGOs.
I'll talk more about less about the origins of conservation, but more about the contemporary practice of conservation as we know it today, and Extinction Rebellion and those who follow it, I gather, are more of younger people whose experience of these matters is pretty contemporary. So I'd like to look at the practice of conservation today. If we look at conservation in Africa particularly, if we look at all the icons, the heroes, those who have saved this, that, or the other species, this, that, or the other place, one thing they have in common is that they're all white. I'm sure many of your members who are keen on conservation and read a lot will be familiar with conservationists in Africa. And they will not be able to name offhand any of them that is Black. Yet this is Africa, where the Black people are actually the majority in Africa south of Sahara, where much of this is going on. So why would this be? This can only mean two things. Either Black people have no affinity whatsoever for wildlife, or there is a problem of discrimination in the sector. And I think it's the latter, because obviously the former would mean, if the former was true, there'd be no wildlife to speak of in Africa. Yet Africa right now leads the world almost in abundance and diversity of megafauna, and people who is also unique in the fact that people share habitats with them. So this shows that the approach, the origins of this practice is flawed. And I'm not just talking about the establishment of national parks, which Stephen has already detailed, but the practice of keeping it going. And the basis that the establishment of these national parks was to remove indigenous people from an area so that the foreign colonialist elite could use the same area for recreation. Yet the people being removed from that area were probably using it for fishing, farming, subsistence hunting, gathering indigenous food plants or medicinal plants, etc., etc. So it's based on disenfranchisement. And the whole of conservation as it's built up to now in terms of policy is based on a Western perception of what African wildlife, the African wilderness, etc., should be. And what do I mean by this? This is the perception that animals, certain species of animals, are beautiful, or they're cute, or they're worth conserving, or they're cuddly, etc., etc. So you see so many conservation organizations in this day and age practicing what they call conservation education, which is a relentless struggle to make local Africans perceive wildlife in the same way that these big game hunters, colonialists, and explorers, quote unquote, perceive these animals. And that's just not the case. As an African, I can say we revere wildlife, we admire many of the animals, but we will not be excited about them in the same way that a foreigner will, because they're part of us. If I had a beautiful right arm, it's part of my body. It won't excite me. If someone else says, "Oh, wow, your arm is beautiful," yes, it's just my arm. I value it and I use it, but I'm not going to get excited about it because it's part of me. And that's the approach that we in the conservation field have completely failed to embrace. Instead, we've relentlessly pushed this colonialist approach that is patently flawed and is unsustainable socially and politically. And if you need evidence of its unsustainability, it lies in the fact that it has to be enforced through the force of arms, through the threat of violence. If I've visited conservation areas in several continents, and it's only in the global south, in Africa, and also to some extent in Asian countries, where conservation is enforced by the force of arms. And conservation itself is a flawed concept, because to us who live with these creatures amongst us, we don't have a word for conservation, because conservation is just the way we live. In fact, the Swahili word used to refer to conservation now, if it's translated properly, it means to keep, which is not conservation. To keep is like the way I put my jacket in the closet. So we have to understand that for this pursuit to be sustainable, socially, environmentally, and politically as well, it has to embrace the viewpoints and the aspirations of the people who live with this wildlife. And right now, it is actually I often describe it as the last remaining colony in Africa, the conservation sector, because it is the only sector where someone can come in from another country or another continent and annex a large tract of land, fence off the indigenous people from it, get arms to threaten or shoot those who venture into it, and keep it for himself or herself. You can't do that to make a tobacco farm. You can't do that to build a factory. You can't do that to build a residential area. But when you approach it from the angle of conservation, it's suddenly acceptable and even praised around the world. Actually, the most powerful land grabbing or colonialist tool in Africa today is the rhino. If you had a rhino, and you can't buy rhinos in certain places in South Africa, if you had a rhino, you'd instantly have a license to annex a few thousand acres of land, fence it, and get a license for firearms to protect it. And all you need really is a rhino. This puts into perspective the sort of effort that African parks under Prince Harry is putting in to move rhinos from South Africa to Chad, and several such bizarre, ecologically bizarre moves. It's about the land. It's about securing land. It's not about survival of a species. Science tells us that where a species lives is logically the place that best suits it. When you move it away, that cannot be a move to preserve that species or to conserve that species. That is a move to consolidate power or get control over a different place. And this is what we must stare at in the face as we face the issue of conservation and conservation of environment and habitats, etc. And then local livelihoods have been destroyed and compromised, as has the resilience of local people. And we are introducing this very fickle industry called tourism to be the basis of conservation. Tourism must take its place as a byproduct of conservation. When an area or a lake or a forest or a species have been successfully conserved, then tourists are welcome to come and see it and enjoy it. But we cannot undertake conservation with tourism as a basis. The coronavirus crisis we are currently going through has ruthlessly exposed that myth that tourism is a valid basis for conservation. There are no tourists coming now. And the indigenous communities who retained their livelihoods like pastoralism or agriculture are doing fine. But those who have found themselves in these microcolonies called wildlife conservancies are suddenly depending on relief food handouts, despite the fact that in Kenya, this has been a very good year as far as rainfall and grass growth, etc., is concerned. It's just tourism that has failed. And this shows how vulnerable or unsustainable tourism is as a basis for conservation. Any upheavals like COVID-19, Ebola, terrorist attack, etc., all these just hit tourism hard. Anyone who depends on it is in trouble. So, but it also shows that it's a power play. When you find people who are specialists in producing livestock, the moment you remove livestock from the scene, you've disempowered them and you've created dependency, which is the aim of conservation right now. And there's also the what Stephen refers to as the racist wolf whistle, that is population. Population is always spoken about as a challenge to conservation in reference to Africa. If put bluntly, it's spoken about in reference to the population of Black people. You never hear of anybody mentioning population of people in China being a threat to conservation of pandas. It just doesn't happen, yet that's the world's most populous nation right now. But you keep hearing of population growth in Africa, and as Stephen mentioned, it's become part of the sort of suite of approaches to conservation in Africa is birth control, coerced or voluntary or compulsory. It's become a key tool. And that comes from this racist perspective that populations of people of color have to be culled, or not culled, but controlled in order to somehow maintain the equilibrium of environment and climate, etc., etc. And climate change is a problem, but it's an aspect of human behavior, consumption patterns, etc. We are still far in Africa. We are still far from the place where absolute numbers of people are having an impact on global climate, and global emissions are lowest from Africa. Yet everything focuses on Africa. Philanthropy always gives towards population control in Africa. And this all draws from the conservation myth of pristine Africa with wildlife and no people in sight. The sort of Africa you see on Discovery Channel, National Geographic, the movie Out of Africa, etc. There are people, but they're white. And this has to change to acknowledge the presence of indigenous populations. Science acknowledges Africa as the cradle of mankind. So we cannot decide in 2020 that suddenly mankind is a problem in Africa. We've always been here before we colonized other continents. So we have to change our thinking. Science has to be honest. Conservation science is extremely dishonest. And the young people, especially those who follow Extinction Rebellion and other such groups, have to stare that in the face and acknowledge it, because sadly, many of the generation before you have been irreparably compromised now into the cult that is conservation. But I think if we engage indigenous people at an intellectual level, we will come up with something sustainable without the use of arms.
So I'm a field researcher. We survivors spend a lot of time with tribal communities in India and in Congo Basin that has been affected by this fortress conservation model. And so usually a conservationist said that this kind of model or protected areas or tiger reserves had been created in the past. And in some cases, this is of course true. And that's so they don't have any power to change what is going on the field. And they give the responsibility of all the horrible things that are happening to the government, and saying African governments are, they have other different standards of human rights. It's impossible for us to have the same standard that we will have in Europe or in the United States. And of course, all of this is fake. The first thing, so we have been working in a new park that is going, WWF has been pushing to create in the north of Congo. The name of this park is Mesogja. It became a little bit of famous park because, well, first of all, we successfully stopped the funding going to the park coming from different parts, European Commission, United States government money, and United Nations money. So we have been campaigning successfully to stop this happening, but it's also, well, it became famous because it's something new. It's a new park that's going to be created. And the entire process of how the park is, and it has been pushed and it's going to be created, show exactly why we should be fighting this very important battle. The Baka, the park is going to be created in the land of the Baka people. They have been living there for generations, and they're a group of hunter-gatherers, sometimes called pygmies. Is a word that we wouldn't use, just to make you understand what we are talking about. WWF have been pushing for the creation of this park for years, more than 10 years, and more than 10 years ago, they helped the Congolese government to set up a field base of park rangers. So the park rangers arrived into the area before the park was being created. These park rangers have been beating, abusing, and arresting the Baka and accusing them of being poachers for 10 years before WWF decided that it was time to ask to the people what they thought about the park. In the meanwhile, WWF has been partnering, dealing and negotiating with logging concessions, mining companies that were working in the area, and the government of Congo, of course. So everyone was aware of this park except the people living and depending on the park. What I wanted to do now is I wanted to explain you the context of what is going on. So there is this park that is going to be created, these park rangers that arrived in the area 10 years ago. And I wanted to read you a page of my field trip note that I wrote when I was there talking with people to make you understand what mean. Because it's everything very abstract for now for us. It's like, it seems like a good thing, you know, WWF go there in Congo to save this forest that is considered one of a pristine forest. So the forest it's so healthy that it also almost seems that there is no one living there. Of course, this is not true. But I'm going to read you what I wrote because I think that explains clearly what the Baka have to deal with every day of their lives. I changed the name of the people involved, but I put similar names. But I think it's important to have names to realize what we are talking about. We are talking about people. So I talked with Metul, this Baka young man who told me, 2 years ago, I was beaten and arrested. They came to my house at night. There were park rangers. There were 7. I remember some of them, Mapucha, Anise, and Sir. They broke the door of the house and found me at home. They hit me with the butt or the barrel of the rifle in the chest and on the back and brought me to the police station. In the police station, they told me, confess that you killed the elephant. But the police said there was no charge against me and I was released. I didn't complain because I know nothing is going to happen. But when they were hitting me, they didn't hit my wife, but they hit my parents, Mabela Bernadette and Mobele Lucien. They were cooking. Mapucha hit Bernadette with the machete, and then again with the rifle, and she fell to the ground. My mother was old. Also my father was hit. He fell to the ground and they stepped on him like an animal. Celestine Mele, a friend, was pregnant that day. And she was so scared, so she fled into the forest. And she had to give birth in the forest. Lipaka, which is my brother, he of course was seeing all of this and he couldn't let the family being hit. So he asked the rangers, why are you coming to hit us? The whole village had fled at that point, but we have not fled. If it is death, we will die here. Sir hit me again with the rifle. He asked me to lie on the ground with outstretched arms and he hit me again with the rifle. When they see that we are pygmies, that is how they call us. They think we are animals. They think that we know nothing and that they can beat us like that. And this is just one of the hundreds of stories like this that I heard. And it's very, for me, the thing that was very shocking when I started doing this work and I have sit down with people I have never seen before in my life. I did this in India, I did this in a lot of places in Congo Basin. It was like, it was so easy to hear these stories. You don't have to spend a lot of time in those villages. You don't have to have a PhD or an important background. You just sit down and ask them, what do you think about this park? What do you think about the ranger? What is your main problem? And in all the indigenous and tribal people that I have been dealing with, they will tell you conservation is worse than colonialism. They will tell you these stories I have told you now. And one of the things I'm very angry about is that when we are having discussions with governments, with the funders of this project, this is funded with our money, with European Commission money or American money, is that they said, this is impossible. It's like, why we didn't heard about it? WWF told us something different. WWF will tell, oh, I didn't know this was happening. Can you give us, every time we complain in the past, they will say, can you give us more details? This is so weird, this is happening. There might be bad apples in the basket of the wonderful conservation. But the truth is, and that is not a bad apple. This is the story that I was saying. This is just one of the stories. I actually like a very troubling moment to find one to tell you, because it's like I have 100 of pages of the stories that of the life of indigenous people living near or inside national parks and tiger reserves in Asia and in Africa. So it's not true that no one knew. You will be surprised to hear and repeat all the time the same word by people living in Myanmar, in Nepal, in India, as I was saying, in Kenya, in Congo, in the Central African Republic. So it is systematic. It is a problem that it's part of a system, of an ideology, as Stephen was explaining, that is racist. The idea behind is that we know better and they don't, we need to protect those forests because we know how to do it, and because we need to keep protecting our way of life, and those people are just, they have to be sacrificed. That is the whole idea about what conservation is about. So what we have been doing is to give voice. This is what survival does. We try to change radically the way that public opinion think and see indigenous people, and how we do that is giving voice to indigenous people, just giving them a platform to speak to the world. And so we have been reading these statements and also filming videos and showing this to the funders. We gave to the European Commission, to the UNDP, the letters of the Baka, and from other tribal too. And we try to explain them that this is what we call conservation. These are terrible human rights abuses. It's not about only people being evicted, which is already a terrible crime, because for indigenous people, land is the most important thing they have. It's not just about that. We are talking about abuses that are like people being raped and tortured, and things that in the name, if they were made and committed in the name of, I don't know, money or other things, we would be condemning it. But because it's about conservation, we just are silent about. And the last thing I want to say is that we have not only been talking with government, we have been talking with a lot of NGOs, a lot of very famous environmental NGOs, and we have been telling these are terrible human rights abuses. This is the biggest threat that indigenous people are now facing in this moment. Is not only about oil and mining companies, it is conservationists. It is not only logging concession. Conservationists are a huge problem for tribal people, and we think that all human rights organizations working about indigenous issues and working about environmental issues should be addressing this problem. And we always got from the other side totally silence. Mostly we can't criticize other environmental NGOs. This is not important as saving the nature. Well, we believe that we can't save the nature if we are criminalizing and violating the right of indigenous people. I think we believe that, and there is scientific evidence that shows that they are the best conservationists, and the two things should be together. But we also think it's a terrible crime that other organizations are not talking about it and are very silent, and this is a kind of complicity. I think, well, we believe that everyone should be speaking up, and it's one of the most important battles that we have to fight.
That this is a battle. I mean, a lot of conservationists will say, oh, all this stuff happened in the past, it doesn't happen now. That is simply not true. And it's actually getting worse. this is a real battle for the future, and it's a battle which does not just involve tribal peoples and indigenous peoples. The big conservation organizations want to turn 30% of the globe into protected areas. They say this is to do with climate change and biodiversity. In fact, it will have exactly the opposite effect for various reasons, which I can go into if we've got time. It will be a complete disaster. It will entail the eviction of tens of millions of people. It would bring widespread starvation. It would bring massive hostility, which will see the end of protected areas wherever it's tried, because people have had enough. And you can push people only so far, as we now see in the United States. And there comes a time when people stand up and say, enough is enough. So this is a real battle for the future of conservation, for the future of climate activism, for the future of concepts of what nature is and whether it's something you stick a fence around and keep people out of, including the people who've actually created those areas in the first place, which is something we haven't touched on. But all these places, including the most apparently wild, are in fact human creations created over thousands of years. The grass plains of East Africa are a result of thousands of years of pastoralism by the local people. So what we see as wild nature just doesn't exist. So it's a real struggle. We often feel our voice is rather a lone one, as Fio has said. We meet an awful lot of conservationists who agree with us, and most of them say, but I can't say anything. There is huge money at stake. Why do they want to do this? Why do they want to push these 30% protected areas? It's mainly about money, power, and control of land. They can sell carbon deals. They can do deals with logging companies, with mining companies, and all the rest of it. So the people going into these organizations, the young people, are full of all kinds of idealistic viewpoints, and as they grow, as they move up the ladder, you find fewer and fewer actual conservationists, more and more business people. Look at the boards who control these things. They're all from the big polluting industries, and at that level, it's nothing to do with conservation at all. So it's a real battle. It's going to go on for many years, and it's going to determine in many ways the future of society and indeed nature around the world.
What should recent conservation graduates, like people who are at university still studying these degrees and who are just learning about this, or people who have just graduated, what can they do? What do you feel it's a role that they can play towards tackling this, both within the university or afterwards?
I think they have to start asking and looking at the questions, asking questions that are not in their research proposals. The research proposals are based on what is known, what is funded, what other people are interested in. So what is outside that generally is where the new stuff lies. And by definition, yeah, discovering something new, it cannot have been in your research proposal, then it wouldn't be new. So I think they have to open their eyes and be brave. Courage is probably the most important thing, alluding to what Stephen said. This is a cult. Conservation science is a cult. And you need to believe in the cult and believe in the prophets and believe in the clergy, if we can call them that. But we need to question these people because they're flawed humans just like all of us. And once we do that and criticize them constructively and clearly, then we will make progress. So let's not just believe blindly. I think that's the most important thing I can tell students. Question everything. Do what you need to do to finish your degree, but keep the questions in your mind. If you stick to what you did in your thesis, you're just entering the box that they designed for you.
Are there any examples of like conservation organizations that are openly, critically engaging with this issue? And do you also see similar atrocities to the ones that you've just mentioned being carried out by conservation organizations that are native?
Conservation organizations, talk about my experience, mostly in East Africa, are currently stuck in the mode we are talking about, because they are being funded, supported, and touted by industrialists, royalty, celebrities, etc. So they're sort of working to justify what their supporters say, and that's a problem. It's almost like a self-fulfilling promise that you need to. If you go around saying that there's a war going on over wildlife, you need to buy guns and go out and shoot people to justify what you've been saying. And that's where the problem lies. Right now, if you talk about the international conservation NGOs, I get often asked, is there any good one? No. I'd love to be proven wrong, but in my experience right now, they're all doing the wrong thing. Certainly in Africa, and they've reached a point where there is so much funding for the wrong thing that they're almost scared to do the right thing. And many of them acknowledge, many people who work for them acknowledge that there is another different way to do things, but they can't talk about it, as Stephen said, or they can't do it for these obvious reasons. So I think it's the biggest problem is about cowardice on the part of conservation practitioners. We do the wrong thing even when we know it's wrong, because we don't want to rock the boat. And the lack of sticking to biology is also a problem. Conservation needs anthropology, it needs sociology, it needs political science, and all those human dimensions, but we are sticking to biology. So you see a lot of the so-called heroes, we talk about conservation heroes, they're all biologists, either specialized in chimpanzee or gorilla or whatever it is. So I think we need to embrace a lot of history, political science, literature, everything into conservation. Then we will find our way out of the mess we are in now.
What reparations should be made to repair the harm that has been committed to a lot of these communities? What would be the steps to repair that harm?
The problem with the question, it would be a bit like saying, well, what should we do under the South African apartheid regime, whilst that apartheid regime was still in force, to help the people who are suffering under it? So you've got to change. The system has to change. The system will change, because if it doesn't change, it will auto-destruct. Basically, people will destroy these protected areas. So it has to change. It's a question of how difficult it is going to be to push that through. There is huge money involved in conservation. You will constantly hear big conservation organizations saying, you know, the rangers are very underfunded, they're very poorly paid, which is all true. The boss of WWF USA's salary is double that of the president of the United States. So there's plenty of money. There are hundreds of millions of dollars going into conservation, and it would not be difficult to do the kinds of the right conservation we're talking about. It would be complex. It would involve a lot of negotiation. It would involve people moving their positions and being open to new positions. But it's complex already. So it's not going to be more complicated than that. So I don't think we're at the stage of reparations, but it is an interesting question. I mean, the entire peoples have been destroyed by the creation of national parks. And as we saw the battle over getting the British to acknowledge the terrible atrocities that went on under the so-called Mau Mau emergency in Kenya, it was a real struggle, but eventually did bring some fruit, and there was an acknowledgement of the kind of atrocities that the British colonists were doing there. So I think it will come, but I don't think we're at the stage yet of worrying about that, whilst the problem is still there.
I'd say what we need to do is change the way we are doing things right now. And the question of reparations, I understand why someone asks that, but if you look at the principle of it, reparations the question implies that there's actually a price that can be paid for what has been done. It's priceless. You can't pay for it. There's no amount of money or whatever on earth that can pay back for that. So I think what we should look at is how can we stop doing the wrong thing and start doing the right thing? As Stephen said, there is so much money in there. Let's now channel it to the right thing, because reparation, like it's incalculable, the price of what has been done.
What should be the approach, the steps to do the right thing?
The right thing is to engage, put indigenous people, their aspirations at the forefront of this. We must stop treating it as a cult. Right now, what happens in Kenya is that someone comes from another continent and comes in and becomes the opinion leader about a certain place or a certain species of animal, becomes the be-all, end-all about that species. It's a form of colonialism. We should partner and intellectually partner with the local people. We should stop investing in technology that helps us avoid talking to them. And what do I mean by this? It's a conservation scientist would come and invest $100,000 to call a few elephants to find out where their migration route is, when he could have spent 30 minutes to ask the local people and they could have told him where the elephants pass. But it's considered to be that valuable to do your own thing without talking to locals, especially when they're Black locals. We have to call this out. And racism has to get out of conservation. And the first step is to stop denying that exists. And I think when the right thing starts happening, you will see more people like me talking about conservation, for lack of, to put it simply. But while Prince William can still come and tell us in Kenya what to do about conservation, we are still doing the wrong thing. And I think we just need to acknowledge the people who look after wildlife, who live with wildlife, as equal partners, not as clients or some client society that needs to be given handouts and given new livelihoods to replace those they've developed over millennia. So the right thing is actually it's a matter of principle, a principle of how you approach it. It will be different in India, it will be different South America, different in Africa, but it's the principle of how you approach it. That's what I think. Thank you.
How should we prioritize social justice versus environmental degradation, ecological collapse in the face of such cataclysmic futures in both fields, when both require urgent action? How should we allocate our limited resources?
It's this popular belief, and I think it's somewhat intellectually lazy for people to think we have to choose one or two of those. If we apply ourselves, our expertise, and our intellect, we can have both of them. It's just that it's a more sophisticated approach. The approach to conservation in Kenya right now is still the approach which was brought by the Victorian gamekeepers who came in 1898. Keep the locals off so that the nobles can enjoy it. So we have a lot of knowledge, but we do not use it because we are taking simplistic approaches, and we are following the visions of sometimes very arrogant private finance who says, how much money should I give you to kick these people out of here? And a conservationist never says, no, we can't kick them out. They say, no, give me $5 million and I'll get them out somehow. So I think we have to embrace this. It's a source of amusement that many scientists were laughing at President Trump for proposing a fence between the US and Mexico, yet they routinely propose fences around conservation areas to conserve ecosystems. There's no difference. If anything, we are worse off because we are supposed to know better. But I think we can have both. We just have to take more time. We have to invest time. We have to invest money in the right places.
So what can someone, like they're at high school and they're still in school, what can they do from their position at school?
The first thing is to talk about it. This is a very deep-seated belief. Mordecai calls it a cult, I think he's right, which has to be challenged. And it's not going to be challenged unless people start saying the truth, saying actually what's going on. And it doesn't mean to say that the teachers are going to agree with it or the curriculum is going to back up our position. Obviously, it's not. We're fighting deeply embedded ideological, even cultish, religious viewpoints. But they can change. I mean, I was looking at, for instance, it sounds like an aside, but it isn't really. The question of mixed marriages. In my lifetime, and I'm in my 60s, in my lifetime, and this is a real figure, most people in the States opposed mixed marriages. They thought it was wrong. The vast majority of the population. During my lifetime, that has completely inverted, so that most people now do not think there's anything wrong with mixed marriages. That's happened in 50 years. So these attitudes, it's a question of changing attitude. We need to start talking about changing attitudes. We need to realize that these wilderness areas are where people live. They are actually created by people. Those people are the best people at protecting them. And the very worst thing we can be doing is to actually destroying those peoples and coming in and trying to do our ham-fisted kind of protection, which is generally doesn't work at all, and certainly doesn't work as well. So it's a sort of, there is a win-win. I mean, what Mordecai has said, it's a win-win. If we back indigenous protection of their own environments in the way they want, everybody wins. The environment wins, human rights wins, we win.
As someone who studied conservation, biology and ecology, and recently beginning to learn and hear from people like you guys about this thing, I've kind of realized just how little we really get taught, which is what has got us in this whole mess in the first place. The reason we hosted this kind of panel discussions is to hopefully begin these conversations within environmentalist like spaces such as XR, because a lot of this evils or harms come in the, packaged as the solutions. And those are the most dangerous, really, the ones that seem like they're coming to do good. And we have to be critical of those if we are to build a better future and actually transform the whole of society. And yeah, we're hoping to potentially do more of these. And this was just like the start to ignite this conversation and hopefully get more people to read into this, because I know like it must be really hard for you guys who've worked in this almost your entire lives to kind of condense it in a few minutes. So thank you.